I was 8 years old. My brother and I, we were at the boys club, and that's where we would normally spend our time as far as after school and evenings. And on that occasion, we were there that evening, and my parents were out at a bowling alley. And from what I understand of the situation, my dad had gotten into an argument previously with an individual, and had kind of ongoing, I guess. And so when he was at the bowling alley, this individual was there also. And so they got in an argument, and my dad, from my understanding, my dad was drinking at the time. And so he went home, and grabbed his gun, went back and shot the guy and killed him. There at the boys club, and one of the directors there was asking for my brother and I, and then we're wondering, well, why is he asking for us? As opposed to any other time. I mean, probably wouldn't make a difference. But when some of the other kids were saying that the cops were looking for us too, at that time we were like, okay, what's really going on? So, we obviously didn't necessarily do anything wrong, so we were wondering what the issue was. And so when the police officers said that we needed to go with them to see our parents, we basically just got in the back of the police car and drove to the police station. So when we got there, we were there for a little bit, and then they said, it's time for you to see your dad now. So when we went to the back area, he was locked behind bars, and basically that's the last time I spoke to him for a long time. He was convicted of manslaughter and was sentenced to 25 to life in prison. I mean, we would have times pretty much on the weekends where my brother and myself and my dad we'd go fishing, off the pier, and bring home a couple of buckets of fish, and that's just kind of our thing that we did at that time. Yeah. But most of my memories prior to that incident at the time, they were good. I think looking back on it, it was one of those things where you kind of question why, what happened, why would it even get to that point? Then you start kind of looking inward and saying, well, what is it that I did as a kid? Could I have done something better? Could I have been a better son? And just started questioning myself as far as, did I do something wrong? And if I did something wrong, why would, my dad allow himself to be in that situation, to take himself, from his family? So a lot of anger at that point came up, and just frustration. But that anger it stayed there for a while. When situations did come up, as far as confrontation or fights, that anger would be in the back of my mind, and that pain would basically just manifest itself, if I did fight, in the form of a fight, or just taking out my anger, in a certain situation or individual. When you see other kids, with their dads, doing things that fathers and sons do, then that's when the feelings come up too. It's like, well, I can't do those things because my dad's not here. And then when they start asking me, well, where's your dad at? Then, I couldn't at the time even talk about it because it would, bring me to tears just because of the situation and the anger that I had. But it's one thing to never have known maybe your dad, which maybe a lot of people do. Dads aren't in a family situation. They were never there, so there's nothing to miss. It's a situation where your dad's there, but then he leaves on his own accord, in a sense, and then he kind of left out of that person's life. But it's one thing where you did have maybe a good relationship, and then all of a sudden that person's kind of just stripped from your life. So it feels like abandonment, but at the same time, it's like that anger and frustration was now maybe manifesting towards authority and specifically law enforcement. Just because I that's who took my dad away. I think a lot of the negative behavior stemmed from not having a male figure in my life. So any friend or mostly friends, guys who I wanted to maybe prove myself to, I would do whatever it took to prove myself, whether, it didn't matter to me. I was just wanting to kind of have that reinforcement that, in a sense, I was maybe wanted or needed, I guess I could say. Once I got into high school and started hanging out with the wrong crowd, that just manifested itself in drinking alcohol, not just beer, drinking liquor. From that point on, and went on to drugs. Later on in life, when I got out of high school, I met some other friends. These friends that I had, they were from areas in the country that they had gang affiliations. So when they came here to Arizona, I started hanging out with them, and whatever they wanted to do and whatever background they had, to me it didn't matter, because if that's what we're going to do, that's what we're going to do. So I think depression set in, and just the feeling of kind of worthlessness and just no hope that things weren't going to get any better. I didn't see that I was going to be able to see my dad anytime soon. So I could have 15, 20 people in the room and still feel isolated. That people don't understand my situation. They don't understand what I'm going through, and it just got to a dark place where I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. But when I initially started dating my wife, I would purposely, well, not at the time, I didn't realize it, but when we started getting closer, I purposely sabotaged our relationship and pushed her away, because I didn't want to, knowing now, looking back then, knowing that I sabotaged the relationship because I didn't want to maybe feel that pain again of losing somebody. So I didn't want to put myself out there, in a sense. And so it happened on 2 occasions where we got into pretty heated arguments, and she was going to leave me at that time. And both incidences where that happened, I attempted suicide. Even after the suicide attempts and going to jail for a period of time, we ended up getting married. We ended up having a child. Even after all that, I still continued to drink alcohol, and it wasn't until I wouldn't necessarily say a chance encounter now, because I know that's not what it was, but I truly believe it was a God appointed time where we were in a financial situation where I wasn't able to basically drive myself to work, so I had to be dropped off. And at this job, an individual that I was training with, he started talking to me about the Bible, started talking to me about Jesus, and if I went to church. And I'm like, yeah, I go to church. And he asked me if I ever read the Bible, and I'm like, well, no, because they have them in the back of the pews at church. And he kind of looked at me strange, and I said, well, no, I've never owned one. So he asked me if I wanted one. I was like, well, I'll end up getting one eventually. So he said, I have one I can give you. And I said, no, that's fine, I can get one. He says, no, I insist that you take this one. So I took the Bible that he offered, and being in the situation I was at the time, I was getting dropped off at this job probably about an hour, hour and a half before it was even time to open up. So I spent a lot of my time those first few hours before work just opened up and started reading from Genesis 1:1. And I had, being in church before, I knew who God was, I knew who Jesus was, I knew things kind of around Christianity, but I really didn't know the details of it. I knew I was supposed to go to church. I knew I was supposed to maybe do good things, good deeds or whatnot, but I really didn't have a relationship with God as what He was telling me at the time. And so that kind of put me on a journey of wanting to know who God was. Previously, when I went to church, it was more of an obligation. I mean, I think I had a desire to go, but I think it was more of a, you go to church because that's kind of what you do, in a sense, to maybe be closer to God, or to do things maybe working to God, in a sense. And then when I started reading, I understood that God is wanting people to come to Him willingly, as opposed to obligation. And the verse that says that we only love God because He first loved us. So that love is something I never was necessarily told about, or maybe I was told about it but never really understood it in church growing up. So kind of with my background, I was told at one time that God is a God to the fatherless, and that kind of it struck a chord with me that if I didn't have my earthly dad in my life, then maybe I could have Heavenly Father, as the Bible says, to be with me, at all moments of the day, sometimes from minute to minute, hour to hour, but that He would always be there with me. So that kind of struck a chord with me that I want to maybe pursue that and see exactly what that means. When after reading the Bible and maybe comparing and contrasting what I was brought up with in church and what I read, there were discrepancies there. But when I went to ask the questions why the discrepancies were there, the only answer I got was, well, this is the way the church does it. So at that point, it just put me at a crossroads of either I continue with the religion that I was brought up with, or I continue with what I actually read about who God is and what He says and what His Word says, and continue on that path. And so I chose the latter. First, I truly gave my life to Jesus Christ, and I made that you should say that confession of who He is and of who I am. That was more important. Is that in reading what I read, that I read that I'm a sinner who's lost in sin, and the wages of sin is death, and the penalty for that is eternity in hell. And once I realized my position before a holy God, I repented and gave my life to Him and trusted in Him, not just believing that He did these things, an acknowledgement, but more of a trust, and saying, okay, yeah, what you've said, what I've read, I put my trust in that fully and completely. And once that happened, I could say instantly, my taste and desire for alcohol went away. It started to change, a little bit over time. But from what I remember and kind of look back on, when I positioned myself to be in God's grace and be in His presence, and to see myself being used by Him, that kind of just put me in awe of where I wasn't really thinking about those things. So in a sense, those thoughts, those attitudes, feelings, emotions were subsided, and the ability to be in God's presence kind of brought out the verse, that you have that peace that surpasses all understanding. So that peace that I was longing for in that time of growing up, that time of just wanting to prove myself, and never having peace because I was always seeking after it. I was always chasing after it. The hope, the despair, all those things, all those emotions, that they were there, and I couldn't get rid of them. But once I gave my life to Jesus Christ, He took that away. I never would have dreamed that I'd basically be standing in front of people, speaking publicly. But that's what God's power did in my life, is that He took that negative part, the shyness, the introvert, recluse, and just allowed me to be bold for His word and His name.